I remember the exact moment the first tire crushed my blueberries, because it sounded like something breaking that shouldn't be broken, soft and wet under heavy rubber, followed by the low diesel growl of an engine that had no business being on my land. And before I even stepped out onto the porch, I could smell it. That mix of sweet fruit and exhaust fumes hanging in the cool morning air like a warning I was already too late to stop. And when I came around the corner of the barn, there it was. A bright yellow bulldozer parked right in the middle of my field, its metal blade dripping purple juice like it had just cut through years of work in a single pass. And behind it stood a line of survey stakes hammered into the soil my grandfather used to walk barefoot on, red flags fluttering like they were marking something already claimed, already lost. And that's when I heard her voice, sharp and cheerful like she was announcing a neighborhood barbecue instead of a takeover. Margaret Whitmore, standing there in pressed white slacks and sunglasses too expensive for someone who had never planted a single thing in her life, holding a clipboard like it was a badge of authority, telling the crew where to line up the next markers. And when she saw me, she didn't even flinch, just gave me that tight smile that never reaches the eyes and said, "Morning, Ethan." Just in time to see progress. Like she was doing me a favor. Like this wasn't the same field my family had worked for 3 generations. The same rows I measured out myself every spring, 48 inches between each line, 1,200 bushes across just under 11 acres. Every inch mapped out with care and sweat and patience. And I could feel the gravel crunch under my boots as I walked toward her, slow, controlled. Because somewhere deep down I already knew that losing my temper would be exactly what she wanted, and I stopped a few feet away, close enough to smell her perfume cutting through the diesel in the air, and I asked her one simple question: "What exactly do you think you're doing on my land?" And she didn't hesitate, not even for a second, just flipped a page on her clipboard and said, "This isn't just your land anymore, Ethan. The HOA approved a community parking expansion last week. And this field is the perfect location, like it was already decided, already signed, already done." And for a moment, I just stood there listening to the engine idle, feeling the ground vibrate under my feet, watching juice from crushed berries soak into the dirt. And it hit me that they hadn't just shown up, they had planned this, scheduled it, probably toasted to it at one of those meetings I never bothered to attend. And I could taste something bitter at the back of my throat. Not anger, not yet. Just the slow realization that this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a move, and Margaret leaned in slightly, lowering her voice like she was letting me in on something confidential. "It's just a blueberry field, Ethan. People need places to park." And that's when I knew she had no idea what she was standing on. No idea what those rows actually represented, and more importantly, no idea what kind of mistake she had just made. I did not raise my voice. I did not step closer. I just stood there listening to that engine idle like it had already decided it belonged. And for a second, I let my eyes drift past Margaret, past the clipboard, past the crew pretending not to look at me. And I focused on the rows, the lines I knew by memory. Each bush spaced with precision my grandfather insisted on back in 1978 when he first planted them by hand. He used to say blueberries do not forgive shortcuts. You either respect the land or it stops feeding you. And I learned that lesson young. Before I even understood what property taxes were or how county zoning worked, I understood that this field was not just dirt and plants. It was timing, soil chemistry, water control, and patience measured in seasons, not weeks. And as the morning sun climbed higher, I could see the damage already done. Tire tracks cutting through 3 rows on the west side. Branches bent, fruit crushed into the soil, and I felt that familiar pressure build behind my ribs. Not panic, not fear, just calculation, the kind that comes when you realize the situation is bigger than what it looks like on the surface. Because Margaret was not acting like someone testing boundaries. She was acting like someone who believed she had already won. And that meant paperwork had been signed somewhere, approval stamped, conversations had happened without me in the room. And that is when I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, not to call anyone, just to open the folder I had not looked at in years. A collection of scanned documents my father insisted we digitize before he passed, back when he was already too tired to walk the full length of the field, but still sharp enough to remind me that land is only yours if you can prove it on paper. And as I scrolled through those files, I could hear Margaret still talking behind me, explaining to one of the workers where the asphalt line would run, describing drainage plans like she had studied this land her whole life. And I almost laughed because she was planning a parking lot on soil that had been tested, certified, and monitored for decades under a program she clearly did not even know existed. And I stopped scrolling when I saw it. The document with the federal seal, the one my father made me read twice when I was 22, the one I thought I would never need to use, and I stared at the identification number printed across the top, while the engine noise filled the air, while the smell of diesel mixed with crushed fruit, and I felt something shift, slow and steady, because this was not going to be a shouting match in a field. This was not going to be solved by arguing with a woman holding a clipboard. And I slipped the phone back into my pocket, looked at Margaret again, really looked this time, at the confidence in her posture, the certainty in her voice, and I realized she had made the kind of mistake that does not show up immediately, the kind that waits quietly until the right piece of paper lands on the right desk. And when she asked if I had anything else to say before they continued work, I shook my head once, calm, controlled, and said, "Go ahead," because in that moment I was not thinking about stopping them. I was thinking about letting them finish exactly what they had started. I walked away before the engine revved again, before the blade dropped for another pass, because there was nothing left to say out there that would matter, not to someone who believed a stamped approval was stronger than history. And as I crossed the gravel path back toward the house, I could still hear Margaret giving instructions behind me, her voice cutting through the steady hum of machinery like she owned every inch of ground she stood on, and maybe in her mind she did. Because people like her do not see land, they see square footage and numbers on a spreadsheet. They see opportunity where someone else sees years of work. And I reached the porch, paused for a second with my hand on the railing worn smooth by 3 generations, and I let the noise settle into the background, let the smell of diesel drift past me, because I needed a clear head now more than anything. And inside the house it was quiet, the kind of quiet that still carries weight. Like the walls remember conversations you can almost hear if you stand still long enough. And I went straight to the kitchen table where the old metal filing box sat, the one my father refused to throw away even after everything was digitized, because he believed in backups you could hold in your hands. And when I opened it, the faint smell of paper and ink rose up, dry and familiar, and I flipped past tax records, soil reports, irrigation permits. Each document a piece of a system that kept this place running long before any homeowners association ever existed. And then I found the folder, thick, labeled in his handwriting, USDA Agricultural Conservation Program. And I ran my thumb along the edge before pulling it out, because I already knew what was inside. I just had not needed to touch it in years. And when I laid the papers flat on the table, the light from the window caught the seal again, that same federal mark I had seen on my phone minutes earlier. Only now it felt heavier, more real, and I remembered the day he explained it to me, how this land was not just ours in the traditional sense, how enrolling in that program meant agreeing to federal standards, environmental protections, usage restrictions that could not be overridden by local boards or neighborhood votes. And back then it sounded like paperwork, like something distant and abstract. But standing there now with the sound of machines tearing through my field just outside, it felt like something else entirely, something Margaret had never accounted for. And I pulled out the attached maps, the boundaries outlined in precise lines, the acreage measured down to fractions, 11.2 acres under protection. Every inch of that blueberry field documented, monitored, and legally bound to agricultural use. And I could feel that same steady shift again, the one that replaces frustration with clarity, because this was not about convincing her she was wrong. This was about showing the right people exactly what she had already done. And I closed the folder carefully, not rushing, not reacting, just moving with purpose. And as I stepped back outside, the noise hit me again, louder now. Another row going down under the weight of progress she thought she controlled. And I watched for a moment, just long enough to see the pattern of destruction continue, long enough to know she was committed. And then I walked past the field, past the stakes and the machines and the confidence standing in the middle of it all, and headed for my truck, because the next conversation was not going to happen out here. It was going to happen somewhere that understood exactly what that seal meant, and more importantly, what happens when someone ignores it. I drove with the windows down, even though the morning air still carried that mix of diesel and crushed fruit, because I needed to clear my head and keep everything sharp. And the gravel road stretched out ahead of me like it always had, familiar, steady, unchanged, which made what was happening behind me feel even more out of place. And as I hit the main road, I could still picture Margaret standing there in my field, confident, organized, completely certain that she was operating within her rights. And that certainty told me everything I needed to know about how far this had already gone, because people do not bring in heavy equipment unless they believe every box has been checked, every approval secured, and somewhere along that chain someone had either ignored or never even looked for the one detail that mattered. And I kept one hand on the wheel while the other rested on the folder sitting on the passenger seat, the edge of that paper pressing against my palm like a reminder to stay focused. And about 20 minutes later, I pulled into the county office building, a place I had only visited a handful of times over the years for routine filings and soil reports. Nothing urgent, nothing like this. And when I stepped inside, the air changed immediately, cool and still, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead replacing the sound of engines and gravel. And I walked straight to the counter where a clerk looked up from her computer, polite but distant, the kind of expression you get from someone who has seen every type of complaint walk through that door. And I placed the folder down carefully, not dramatic, just deliberate, and said I needed to speak with someone about an active land use violation. And she gave me that standard response about zoning approvals and HOA jurisdiction, the same language I expected, the same framework Margaret was probably relying on. And I let her finish before I opened the folder and turned it so the seal faced her, and I watched the shift happen in real time, subtle but unmistakable, her eyes pausing for half a second longer than before, her posture straightening just slightly. And she reached for the document, scanning the header, the program identification number, the acreage designation, and then she looked back up at me, not dismissive anymore, just careful, and asked where exactly this property was located. And I gave her the address, watched her type it in, watched the screen reflect in her glasses as she cross-checked something I could not see, and the silence stretched for a few seconds longer than it should have. And then she said she needed to get someone from compliance, someone who handled federal program coordination, and she picked up the phone without asking another question. And I stepped back from the counter, resting my hands on the edge of it, steady, patient, because this was the part that mattered, not the argument in the field, not the conversation with Margaret, but this moment right here where the right information reached the right person. And as I stood there waiting, I could almost feel the distance between that quiet office and the noise back at my land, the difference between assumption and authority. And when a man in a pressed shirt with a county badge stepped out from the back office and picked up the folder, flipping it open with practiced efficiency, I knew we had crossed into a different kind of conversation entirely, one that did not depend on opinions or HOA votes, one that depended on what was already written, already filed, already binding whether anyone had bothered to check it or not. The man with the county badge did not rush, and that was the first sign this was not going to be handled like a routine complaint. He flipped through the pages slowly, eyes moving line by line, pausing at the federal seal, then at the program identification number, then at the boundary maps, and I could hear the faint scratch of paper against paper as he adjusted the documents under the fluorescent lights. And when he finally looked up at me, his expression had shifted from neutral to something more precise, more focused, like he had just connected two pieces that were not supposed to overlap. And he asked me one question, simple and direct. They have already started work on this land. And I nodded once, not adding anything extra, because I wanted him to reach the conclusion himself. And he exhaled slowly through his nose, the kind of controlled breath people take when they know the situation just escalated beyond local authority. And he closed the folder halfway, tapping it lightly against the counter as if organizing his thoughts. And then he turned slightly toward the clerk and said something about pulling up the Federal Registry cross-reference. And I watched her move faster now, fingers moving across the keyboard with a different kind of urgency, not panic, just recognition. And within seconds another screen was up, something official enough that neither of them needed to explain it out loud. And the man flipped the folder open again, matching what he saw on paper with what was on the screen. And I could see the confirmation settle in, quiet but absolute. And he looked back at me and said, "This property is enrolled under a federally protected agricultural conservation program." Not as a question, but as a statement. And I said, "It has been for decades," keeping my voice even, because this was not about proving a point. It was about letting the process unfold exactly the way it was designed to. And he nodded once, then reached for the phone behind the counter. Not the general line, not the front desk extension, but something more direct, and as he dialed I stepped back again, giving him space, because at this point the conversation was no longer mine to lead, and I listened as he spoke in clear, measured terms, referencing the program code, the acreage, the active land disturbance currently in progress. And there was a pause on the other end long enough for me to hear the faint hum of the office again. And then he gave the address, repeated it once. Slower, like he was making sure there was no mistake. And when he hung up, he did not look surprised. He did not look alarmed. He just looked certain. And he turned back to me and said, "You need to understand, this is not something an HOA can override." Like he was clarifying the rules for both of us, even though I already knew them. And I nodded again, because hearing it from him mattered more than saying it myself ever could. And he continued, explaining that any unauthorized alteration of land under that program could trigger federal review, penalties, enforcement actions that went far beyond fines or local disputes. And as he spoke, I could feel the gap widening between what was happening back at my field and what was about to happen next. And for the first time since I saw that bulldozer, I allowed myself to take a slow breath. Not relief. Not yet. Just the steady awareness that the situation had shifted into something Margaret Whitmore could not control, no matter how many approvals she thought she had. Because the moment that call went through, this stopped being a neighborhood decision and became a federal matter. And those do not move fast, but when they do move, they do not stop. Halfway, I stayed at the counter a few minutes longer, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to watch the process settle into motion, the kind you cannot see but you can feel, like pressure building behind a closed door. And when the man with the county badge finally handed the folder back to me, he did it with both hands, careful, respectful, like it carried more weight than just paper. And he told me someone from federal oversight would likely be in contact soon. Not a promise, not a guess, just a statement based on experience. And I nodded, thanked him, and turned to leave, the quiet of the office following me out until the door closed and the outside air rushed back in, warmer now, carrying a faint trace of diesel even from that distance. And as I got back into my truck, I did not rush the engine. I just sat there for a second with my hands resting on the wheel, letting everything line up in my head. Because what mattered now was timing, not reaction. And when I pulled out of the lot and headed back toward my land, the road felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had the uncertainty from earlier replaced by something steadier, something that does not need to prove itself out loud. And about 15 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a number I did not recognize, and I let it ring once, twice, before answering, keeping my voice neutral. And the man on the other end introduced himself with a title that included federal compliance and agricultural conservation, his tone direct, efficient, no wasted words. And he confirmed my name, the property location, the program identification number, each detail lining up exactly with the documents I had just handed over. And then he asked the question that mattered. Is there currently active disturbance on the enrolled acreage? And I looked out through the windshield at the stretch of road ahead, empty, quiet, and said, yes, they started this morning. And there was a brief pause, not confusion, not hesitation, just the sound of someone processing next steps. And he said they were dispatching a field officer to assess the situation immediately, emphasizing that no further activity should be taking place on that land until a review was completed. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was over, but because it had officially moved beyond anything Margaret could manage with a clipboard and a meeting agenda. And I thanked him, ended the call, and kept driving, the sun now higher, casting long shadows across the road as I turned onto the gravel path leading back to the house. And as the tires crunched beneath me, the sound felt sharper, more defined, like every detail was coming into focus. And when the field came back into view, I could see the machine still there, still moving, still operating under the assumption that nothing had changed, and Margaret stood exactly where I had left her, directing, organizing, confident. And I parked the truck without drawing attention, stepped out, and leaned against the door for a moment, watching, not interrupting, not announcing anything, just observing the final minutes of a plan that had already run out of time. Because somewhere between that office and this moment, a different authority had entered the picture, one that does not argue, does not negotiate, it simply arrives, and when it does, everything else stops. I stayed where I was, leaning against the truck with my arms folded, watching the rhythm of the machines as they moved across the field like nothing had changed, like this was just another scheduled job on another piece of land that had already been cleared for use. And for a few minutes, it almost looked normal if you ignored the crushed rows and the uneven lines where the tires had cut through decades of careful spacing. And Margaret was still talking, still pointing, still organizing, her voice steady and confident as she directed the crew to extend the markers another 20 feet toward the east boundary. And I could see the pattern now, the way she worked, efficient, controlled, completely certain that she was building something permanent. And then I heard it, faint at first, a different kind of engine, not the heavy rumble of construction equipment, but something smoother, sharper, coming down the gravel road behind me. And I did not turn right away, I just listened. As it got closer, the sound cutting clean through everything else until it became impossible to ignore. And when I finally looked over my shoulder, I saw the vehicle crest the hill, a dark government SUV, clean lines, no markings loud enough to announce anything but official enough that you did not need to guess what it was, and it did not slow down as it approached, just rolled forward with quiet certainty until it came to a stop at the edge of the field. And for the first time that morning, the pattern broke. One of the workers hesitated, the bulldozer idled without moving forward, and Margaret turned, her posture shifting just slightly as she registered something new entering her space. And the door of the SUV opened with a solid, deliberate motion, and a man stepped out, dressed plain but precise, button-down shirt, dark pants, nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just someone who knew exactly why he was there. And he did not look around in confusion or ask for direction. He walked straight toward the field, eyes scanning the ground, the stakes, the machinery, taking it all in with a kind of quiet assessment that did not need commentary. And when he reached the first row of damaged bushes, he stopped, crouched slightly, touched one of the branches, then stood back up and looked toward Margaret. And she met him halfway, clipboard still in hand, already speaking before he said a word, explaining the project, the approvals, the community need, her voice carrying that same practiced confidence. But it sounded different now, just slightly thinner, like something underneath it had shifted, and the man listened without interrupting, hands relaxed at his sides, and when she finished he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, not large, not complicated, just a single sheet that he opened carefully and held out in front of him. And even from where I stood I could see the moment it landed, not physically, but in the way Margaret's posture changed, the way her shoulders tightened just a fraction, the way her voice stopped mid-sentence as her eyes moved across the page, and the field went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with engines or noise. A different kind of silence, the kind that settles when something final has just been introduced. And the man spoke then, calm, clear, not loud, but every word carried across the space between them, and whatever he said did not need repetition, because the reaction was immediate, the crew stepping back, the engine shutting down, the movement stopping all at once like someone had flipped a switch, and I pushed myself off the truck slowly, not rushing, not reacting, just watching as the plan Margaret had built all morning came to a complete halt without a single argument, without a raised voice, just a piece of paper and the authority behind it doing exactly what it was designed to do. The silence held longer than anyone expected, the kind that stretches just enough to make every small movement feel louder. The faint ticking of a cooling engine, the soft shuffle of boots against gravel, the rustle of paper in the federal officer's hand as Margaret stared at it like it might change if she read it twice. And I could see her trying to recover, trying to find the angle where she was still in control, her fingers tightening around the clipboard as she started speaking again. Slower now, more careful, referencing permits, approvals, community votes, everything she had stacked up to justify what was happening. But it sounded different, like she was reading from a script that no longer applied. And the man listened again, patient, letting her finish, and when she did he shook his head once, not dismissive, just final, and pointed toward the field, toward the rows, toward the damage already done. And even from where I stood I could tell he was not debating her. He was documenting. Each word measured, each detail noted. And that was the shift she had not prepared for, because arguments can be won or lost, but documentation just moves forward, step by step, until it reaches somewhere you cannot influence. and one of the workers approached quietly, asking if they should continue, and Margaret hesitated, just for a second, before answering, and that hesitation said more than anything else, because for the first time she did not have an immediate response, and the officer answered before she could, calm, clear, instructing them to shut everything down until further notice. And this time there was no debate, no pushback, just compliance, engines turning off one by one, the field settling into stillness as the last machine powered down, and the air shifted with it, the sharp edge of diesel fading just enough to let the sweetness of crushed berries come back through, and I pushed off the truck and walked closer, not directly into the center, just enough to be part of the scene without interrupting it. And Margaret saw me then, really saw me, not as an obstacle, but as the person she should have accounted for from the beginning. And there was something different in her expression now, not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize the rules you were playing by were never the only ones in place, and she started to say something, maybe to me, maybe to the officer, but stopped halfway, like the words no longer carried the same weight, and the officer folded the document back up, slipped it into his pocket, and began outlining next steps, inspection, review, potential penalties, all in that same steady tone that never rises because it does not need to. And I stood there listening, hands at my sides, feeling the ground under my boots, uneven now where the machines had passed, but still mine, still defined by boundaries that did not change just because someone decided they should. And as the crew began packing up equipment, quieter now, more cautious, I looked out across the field, at the rows that remained untouched, at the lines that still held their shape, and I knew this was not the end of it, not yet, but it was the moment everything shifted permanently, the moment a plan built on assumption met a system built on record, and only one of those keeps moving forward once it starts. By late afternoon, the field looked quieter than it had in years, not untouched, not perfect, but still standing in a way that mattered more than appearance. The machines were gone, the stakes had been pulled, and the only marks left were the tracks pressed into the soil, like a reminder of how close it came to becoming something else entirely. And I walked the rows slowly, boots sinking slightly into the ground where the tires had passed, brushing my hand along branches that were still intact, still holding fruit that had not been crushed under someone else's plan. And the air had shifted back to something familiar, that mix of earth and sweetness that does not need explanation if you have grown up around it. And behind me, I could hear the low murmur of voices near the edge of the property, Margaret speaking with someone on her phone now, her tone controlled but tighter than before, the kind of voice people use when they realize they are no longer setting the direction of the conversation. And I did not need to listen to know what she was saying, because at this point the details were already in motion somewhere beyond both of us, moving through systems that do not care about intent or presentation, only about what was done and where it was done. And I stopped near the center of the field, right where the first row had been cut through that morning, and I crouched down, pressing my hand into the soil, feeling the dampness just below the surface, the same consistency it had always been, unchanged by the noise that had passed over it hours earlier. And I thought about my grandfather measuring this land with nothing but a tape and a stubborn sense of precision, about my father explaining documents I did not fully appreciate at the time, about how both of them understood something simple that gets ignored too often, that ownership is not just what you stand on. It is what you can prove when it matters. And I stood back up, looking across the full 11.2 acres, every line still mapped exactly where it belonged. And I realized that Margaret never actually saw this place, not the way it needed to be seen. She saw open space, empty land waiting to be repurposed, and that was her mistake, because what looked empty to her was already defined, already protected, already part of something larger than a neighborhood decision. And as the sun dropped lower, the shadows stretched across the rows again, long and even, the way they always do at the end of the day, and I turned back toward the house. The sound of gravel under my boots steady and familiar, and I did not feel the need to say anything to her, not now, not later, because the outcome was already set in motion the moment that document left my hands and reached the right desk. And whatever came next, inspections, reports, penalties, none of it would require me to raise my voice or argue my case in a meeting room, because this was never about being louder or faster. It was about being right in a way that holds up when everything else falls away. And as I stepped onto the porch and looked back one last time at the field, I knew one thing for certain. They thought they were taking land for a parking lot, but what they actually did was trigger something they could not stop, and the difference between those two things is where the truth always wins.